In this video, I'll be showing you how to solve equations by factoring and finding the square roots. So what does it mean to find the zeros of a quadratic? If you were to graph a quadratic that we have done in past videos, to find the zeros of a quadratic, you are looking for where it crosses the x-axis. So for example, in this quadratic, it crosses the x-axis at 1 and it crosses the x-axis at -4. So those would be considered the zeros of the quadratic function. Now there is something called the zero product property. So it says that if you have two functions or two variables that's equal to 0, if you have two functions multiplied together that's equal to 0, then either one of these functions could equal 0 in order for the entire thing to equal 0. Meaning, if b equaled 5 but a equaled 0, it would still give you 0. Or if a equaled 2x plus 3y minus 7, but b equaled 0, the entire thing would still equal 0. So what you can do is you have two linear factors, which we have discussed, two linear factors. If you set them equal to 0, that means either x minus 3 can equal 0 in order for the whole thing to be 0, or x plus 4 can be equal to 0. Because as long as one of the factors is equal to 0, then the whole thing is going to equal to 0. So to solve for x, you would add 3 to both sides and get x equals 3. Here you would subtract 4 on both sides and you would get x equals a -4. And that actually will also tell you the zeros of that function. X minus 3 times x plus 4 if you were to graph it. If you plugged in this function, which is x minus 3 times x plus 4, and if you were to graph it, it would cross the x-axis at -4, which we got, and at +3, which we got. And if you're not really sure, you could hit second trace, and you want the 0 of the function. So for example, in this one, you would need to go somewhere on the left-hand side, hit enter. Somewhere on the right-hand side, hit enter, and you would get your answer of 3. Same thing with -4. In this example of the second one, anytime you have a variable in more than one term, for example, you have an x squared here and an x here, then the only way to solve this is it has to be equal to 0, which means I need to add 15 to both sides first, set it equal to 0, and now we can solve this. You've learned in past how to factor when you have a number in front. So the first step is the illegal move. You multiply 2 times 15 to get 30, and then the middle term is -11. So what multiplies to give you 30 and adds to give you -11? -6 and -5. So you would get x minus 6 and x minus 5. And then you're not done though. Remember, this illegal move. Since you multiplied in the first step, you now have to divide in the second step. 6 divided by 2 is 3. This does not reduce, so you throw the 2 in front. And you now have two factors equal to 0. So either x minus 3 will be 0, or 2x minus 5 can give you 0. So to solve for x, you would add 3 to both sides. You would add 3 to both sides, and you would get x equals a +3. Or, to solve on this case, you would add 5 to both sides, and then you would divide by 2, and you would get 5/2. And these are the two answers. If you were to graph this, well, once you would actually graph this part because you need to set equal to 0. Once you graph it, it would cross the x-axis at 3 and it would cross the x-axis at 2.5, which is 5/2. Now to solve by factoring, you might be wanting to do something like, well, if I divide both sides by 8x, I will get 2x equals 1 because the x squared over x cancels. Okay, you actually cannot do that. And the reason why is because since you do not know what x represents, You can't divide both sides by x because if x equals 0, you would be dividing by 0. You cannot do that. So a minute ago I told you that anytime you have a variable that is in more than one term, here you have x, you have it in x squared, and here you have an x, you have to set it equal to 0. Have to. So to set this equal to 0, I'm going to subtract 8x from both sides. I will get 16x squared minus 8x equals 0. Remember, you always want it set equal to 0. Now, based off of a previous video, we learned how to factor this. First, you always take out what's in common. There is an 8 in common in both terms, and there is an x in common. So you can factor out an 8x. And then what's left? 8 times 2 gave you 16. And if I factor out an x, I still have one x left. And then I factored out this entire term. I pulled out the 8 and I pulled out the x, so you need a placeholder of a 1. Now that you have two factors that are multiplied together, 8x and 2x minus 1, you can now set them both equal to 0. 8x could equal 0, or 2x minus 1 could equal 0. In this case, you would divide by 8 and you would get 0. In this case, you would have to first add 1 to both sides, and then divide by 2, and you would get 1/2. And again, if you were to graph this function right here, then it would cross in two places. It would cross the x-axis at 0, and it would cross it at 0.5, or 1/2. In this case, to solve by factoring, you actually could, in this case, you would first, I noticed that there is an x in common, so you can pull an x out front. And if I pull or factor out an x, I'm left with x squared minus 5x minus 6. Now this, I still have an x, and this right here factors, if you do the big X, it factors into -6 and +1, because -6 plus 1 is -5, and -6 times 1 is -6. Now you have 3 factors all multiplied together. So you actually are going to set all of them, or each of them, equal to 0. So you'll set x equal to 0, you'll set x minus 6 equal to 0, and you'll set x plus 1 equal to 0. So x could be 0, x could equal 6, because you would add 6 to both sides, and then x could equal -1, because you would subtract 1 from both sides. So there is one other way to solve in this case that we're going to learn today, and that is to solve by finding square roots. Normally you would factor. However, if you notice, x is only in one term. So anytime x is in one term, solve for x. Meaning I can actually solve for x, which means I would add 180 to both sides, and then I would divide by 5 first. You can't take the square root yet because you got to get rid of the 5. And 5 gives 180 36 times. Now that you have x squared by itself, now you can take the square root of both sides, and I'll get x equals plus or minus 6. Here's where it's big. The square root of 36 is 6, but because you're taking the square root of both sides, you got to do the positive and its negative. Because if I was to plug this back in, if I plug -6 back in, -6, the moment I square it, becomes a positive 36, and then multiplied by 5 gives you 180. The -6 works and the positive 6 works. So do not forget, make sure that you put that this should be 6 and -6. On this second one, to solve for x, you would add 1 to both sides, and then you would divide by 4. You cannot take the square root first yet. You need to first divide by 4 to get 1/4. And now that you have square root by itself, you can take the square root of both sides, and you'll get x equals plus or minus 1/2. Don't forget the plus or minus. The square root of 1 is 1, the square root of 4 is 2. So basically the plus or minus means you'll get the -1/2 and you'll get a positive 1/2, or you can just write it as a plus or minus. So at this point, what I would like for you to do is to pause the video, work through these problems, and then resume it to see how I've worked out the problems. So for the first one, this has to be equal to 0, and it's not. So I need to add 6 to both sides, and I will get 6x and 8x give me 14x. And now that it's equal to 0, now I can factor. This factors into 9 and 5, because 9 plus 5 is 14, and 9 times 5 is 45. Since they're set equal to 0, you can set each factor equal to 0. And so your answer would be -9, because you would subtract 9, and -5, again, because you would subtract 5 from both sides. The second one, again, it has to be equal to 0. So I'm going to get everything on the left-hand side. So I'm going to subtract 7x to get a -4x, and then subtract 3. This is the illegal move because you have a number in front. So first thing is multiply the first times last to get -12. And I believe the answer should be a -6 and a +2, because -6 plus 2 is -4, and that gives you -12. So you get x minus 6 and x plus 2. But the illegal move, there's one step we have to undo. Where we multiplied the first step by 4, we now have to divide by 4 and reduce. This will give you 3/2. This will give you 1/2. And now you can pull the numbers out front. So you get 2x minus 3 and 2x plus 1. Now you can solve for both. 2x minus 3 equals 0. 2x plus 1 equals 0. So you would add 3 to both sides and then divide by 2, and you'll get 3/2, which is interesting because that's actually what that number is right there. So just know that that's what it comes to. In this case, you would subtract 1 and divide by 2, and you get -1/2 for both. And again, it's the opposite of the 1/2. And last, to solve, you would need to get everything on the same side. So I need to add 2x, which cancels that 2x, and I subtract 4, and I get -16. In this case, because x is by itself, there's only one term, I can actually solve for x. So I'm going to add both sides by 16, and then I have x squared by itself. I can take the square root of both sides, and I'll get x equals plus and minus 4.